Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. Like I said, we're beginning an Advent series, Christmas series, Advent coming, arrival, as we talked about last week. I've done a lot of Christmas series now over the years. And I think I begin every Christmas series by saying the same thing, and that is, I find them very difficult. Especially the longer I go on in ministry. And I find them difficult. For one, you know the story, many of you, and you know it well. And if you've been around the church at all, you've listened to a lot of sermons on Christmas. Some of you, when I look out in the audience, have probably heard hundreds of Christmas messages. And that's difficult because, again, you could just tune me out, number one, because you can fill in the blanks already. You could probably teach some of the things I'm going to teach much better than I could. But secondly, what makes this difficult is that even though you've heard, like I said, some of you, hundreds of Christmas sermons, there's only a few Christmas passages. Now, technically, you could pick any passage on Jesus and make it Christmas-y. But there's not too many Christmas passages that speak about the coming of Jesus. And so if you've been doing this for a while, there's a great chance that you've taught on a passage on Christmas maybe 3, 4, 5 times before. And that's challenging. That's challenging to me personally. But then there's the reality, to make more personal. And I've had some conversations with some of you over the last couple of weeks about Christmas, and the reality is some of you just don't like Christmas. It brings stress to you, right? It brings stress. It brings, for some of you, it depresses you for a number of reasons. You can't wait to get to January, right? You can't wait to get back to work, finally, right? So you don't have to do more Christmassy stuff. And then there is some of you who are the exact opposite, right? You love Christmas. I mean, you're decorating in September. Like that's who you are. I mean, you can't get enough of it. Christmas carols, you listen to them in the summer. You know, that person. So you can't get enough. And all you do is drive the rest of us crazy. And so it sort of adds to the difficulty. I was thinking about it this morning. My wife could back me up on this. For probably the last, 20 years of my mom's life, she would put the Christmas tree out, but she wouldn't take it down. She would just throw a sheet over it. I'm not kidding. It would get moved to a different room, but quite literally for about 20 years, we had a Christmas tree in our house 365 days a year. I don't know if she just loved it or she just lazy, but it's one of the two. And so when you bring all of this stuff together, it's a bit of an uphill battle when you enter a new Christmas series, but I'm willing to fight this battle because I believe it's worth fighting for. Because when you strip away all of the extracurriculars of Christmas, some of them good, some of them not so good, the extraordinariness of what we celebrate at Christmas is beyond description. Look at the following from something called the Athanasian Creed. I'll read it for you. The Athanasian Creed, if you've never heard of it, it was written in response to a misunderstanding of what the Trinity was. This is part of it, and this regards Jesus specifically. I'll read it. We believe and confess that our Lord Jesus Christ, God's Son, is both God and human, equally. He is God from the essence of the Father, begotten before time. And he is human from the essence of his mother, born in time. Completely God, completely human, with a rational soul and human flesh equal to the Father as regards divinity, less than the Father as regards humanity. Although he is God and human, yet Christ is not two, but one. He is one, however, not by his divinity being turned into flesh, but by God's taking humanity to himself. He is one, certainly not by the blending of his essence, but by the unity of his person. For just as one human is both rational soul and flesh, so too the one Christ is both God and human. Now, if you hear that and go, I don't quite get it, but it sounds great, that's the right response. And that's the reason, that's one of the reasons why we make time every year to remember the wonder of the coming of the God-man, the eternal Christ, the very God of very God. The creator and the sustainer of all things came, and he came as a baby, fully reliant on his mother's milk, fully reliant on the warmth of his swaddling cloth, making a crib in a barn animal feeding trough. The all-knowing one having to grow in wisdom. The all-powerful one having to grow in stature. The all-present one having now to walk place to place. It's not a wonder, it's the wonder of all wonders. And among the wonders of it is that he came in love for you and for me. And that's why, in spite of the challenges that come with this season and come with a series like this, I do a Christmas series every year. Because it's wonderful of what we get to remember, and remember we must, of what God has done in great humility and humiliation in coming to us in flesh. The creator becoming creation, coming for us. We've called this year's series, and you can see it on the screen, The Eyes of Advent. And all we're going to be doing in this series is looking at the Christmas story, what we would call the first Christmas, through the eyes of different players in it. So today we'll look at Christmas and the coming of Jesus through the eyes of Herod and the wise men. Next week we'll take a look at the Christmas story through the eyes of Joseph, the husband of Mary. We'll look at the coming of Jesus then through Mary's eyes. And then on Christmas Eve, I'm going to a non-traditional Christmas text. And we'll look at the coming of Jesus through our eyes on this side of Christmas and on this side specifically of the cross. So let's take a look at our text. We're looking at verses 1 to 18. Let me read it for us, and then we'll start highlighting some things from it. Verse 1, Matthew 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Love that verse. We'll come back to it. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose, and he took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son," to a better Exodus, by the way. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and he killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Let me pray, and then I'll highlight some things as I said. So guide us now, please. Guide us now, Father, through this text. And I do pray, I'll pray, I'm sure, dozens more times over these days ahead, that you would stir in us a freshness and a receptivity to this message that perhaps we have heard so much and sort of become inoculated to the wonder of it. So turn hard hearts into soft ones and help us to see, like I said, the wonder of this yet again. In Jesus, your name I pray. Amen. So it's a big passage. Lots in it. So what I want to do this morning to help us a little bit understand what's taken place is I want to break it down by pointing out 4 reasons that I see, that I think the text reveals, 4 reasons that Jesus came as seen through the eyes of Herod and the wise men. So if you, again, like taking notes, here's the first reason Jesus came, and that is Jesus came for the nations. Take a look at verse 1. Go halfway through verse 1, and you see the word behold there. Behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. The word behold is meant to grab our attention. It's a teaching device. It's Matthew's way of saying to the reader, slow down here. There's something that you need to behold. You need to see this and look at. And what is it? Well, wise men. Magi, magicians, perhaps astrologers, royalty, more than likely, have come from the east. Where? Well, we don't know specifically where. Some people suggest Babylon, which, if you know anything about the story of Babylon and the story of God, is remarkable. But they come from the east. People say, and use the language of, they're coming from the Orient. They're coming from back east. We actually sing a song about these guys. We 3 kings of Orient are bearing gifts. We traverse afar, field and fountain, moor and mountain, following yonder star, O star of wonder, star of night, star with royal beauty bright, westward leading, coming from the east, still proceeding, guide us to thy perfect light. That song's about this. Why 3 kings? Why 3 kings from Orient are? Well, because of the gifts they bring. They bring three gifts. We'll take a look at the gifts at the back end, but that doesn't mean there are only 3 kings. They just bring 3 gifts. There could have been dozens of kings that came from afar. But we'll get there and look at their gifts, like I said, on the back end. Back to this call to behold. See if I can explain the significance of this. If you came to my house, we're hanging out in the kitchen, having a coffee, and the doorbell, rang, and I went to the door, and Michael Jordan was there. Like the GOAT, the greatest of all time. And he's wearing his jersey. Kind of weirdly, but that's what he's doing. He's there. If you were with me, you would go, well, this is surprising. I would go, yes, this is surprising. And then you would say, Norm, behold, Michael Jordan is in your house. That's verse 1. Verse 1 is exactly that. Matthew is wanting us to look and wonder. And he's wanting us to notice. He's wanting us to ask the question, why are they here? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And the answer to that question of why are they here is because this is who Jesus came for. Jesus came, and we need to see this at his birth. He didn't come for Israel only, but he came for the nations. He came for the ends of the earth, which is good news for us because we live here in the ends of the earth. It doesn't get much farther from Jerusalem than Vancouver, but that's who he came for. He came for his own people. Yes, he came for the people living in Jerusalem, but he came for people like this as well. And Matthew wants us to see it. Matthew and Luke are the only two gospels of the four that record anything about the birth of Jesus and the early years of Jesus. But unlike Luke, Matthew doesn't write about the shepherds coming to visit Jesus in the stable. What Matthew does here is he focuses on these foreigners from the east coming to see Jesus. And like I said, our call in this as readers is to behold it. Some of you know the last words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. It's what is referred to as the Great Commission. Let me remind you of what the Great Commission is. Matthew 28, Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. But Matthew actually begins the same way that it ends. Jesus coming for the nations on the front end, and Jesus calling us to go to the nations on the back end, but not only calling us to go to the nations, but empowering us to do so. So that when we knock on doors and invite people to Jesus, well, perhaps God in his providence has set everything up for that moment in time with our call, not to wait until they come. No need for power for that. Our call is to go in the power of the Holy Spirit, to go and to knock and to invite people to come to Jesus. The call to the nations in Matthew's gospel, bookend the gospel. It starts with Jesus coming for the nations, and it ends with Jesus calling us to go to the nations. Speaking of the coming of Jesus, Isaiah prophesies in Isaiah 60 verse 3, and nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Again, that's our text. That's what's taking place in Matthew chapter 2. It's a light leading the nations to the light of the nations. But before the wise men get to Jesus, they have an encounter with Herod, which leads to something else we see through their eyes about the coming of Jesus, and that is Jesus came to bring division. Let me show you what I mean. When the wise men arrive in Jerusalem, in verse 2, they start asking around town, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? So they're in the city asking questions. Herod finally hears about this. And in verse 3, we read that he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. Troubled is a pretty tame word. It literally means agitated. He's agitated. And why is he agitated? Well, because he's the King of the Jews. And you got a group of people going, hey, where is he who is born King of the Jews? So he's agitated. In fact, this butting up against Herod is emphasized by Matthew in what we read, because Matthew keeps on coming back to the fact that Herod is king. And now we have a a group of people asking about another king of the Jews. I mean, look at verse 1. Verse 1, Matthew writes there about Herod the king. In verse 3, when Herod the king heard this. And then in verse 9, the king, his kingship is brought up again after the wise men listened to the king, but now they come into town and start asking about another king. What's going on here? Well, let's pick up the story, because what Herod does in verse 4 is he calls in the theological experts of the day, the scribes and the chief priests, and he asks where the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, was to be born. And they knew because they were experts. They knew the Bible, what we would call the Old Testament, their scriptures. They knew their scriptures. And so in verse 5, they answer, it's going to be born in Bethlehem, 8 kilometers away. Bethlehem from Jerusalem. And they know that because they know the prophet Micah. And Micah, in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, which is quoted in verse 6 of our text, we read there, "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." So what does Herod do? Well, in response to this news from these experts, he calls in the wise men. And in verses 7 and 8, he asks them some questions about the star specifically. And what he finds out is, well, they've been on the road for quite some time. In fact, if you ever see the wise men in the nativity scene, it's wrong. He's probably baby Jesus here, about 2 years old. Well, I'll tell you why that is in a moment. But he asks them questions. Tell me about the star. And then what he says to them is, go to Bethlehem. And he gives them an instruction in verse 8. When you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. This sets the stage for what comes next. As I meditated, just spent some time thinking through what we've seen thus far and what we know is coming, I saw something this week that I've never seen before and never considered before. Perhaps you have, so I'm just getting caught up to you. But let me explain what I mean by this. We don't know what prompted the wise men to travel to Jerusalem. We know that a star guided them to Jerusalem. We all agree with that. That's very clear in the text. But we don't know how they came to know that the king of Israel, the king of the Jews, was to be born. And they also knew that he wasn't simply the king of the Jews because they came to worship him. So they know he's the Messiah. They know he's the Christ. But we don't know how they knew that. I mean, they didn't even know where the Messiah would be born specifically, like the religious leaders did, as we heard. They just were guided by this star to Jerusalem. Matthew doesn't tell us how they came to know about him. Like I said, we can guess. Maybe an angel of the Lord came. Maybe God said something audibly. Maybe the star itself was so significant, they just knew because of the star. We don't know. But what about the star specifically? What do we learn about the star in this text? What do we know about it? Well, we know from verse 2 that it led the wise men to Jerusalem. That's interesting. It leads them to Jerusalem, and then it seems to disappear on its arrival. And then it reappears in verse 9, where we are called a second time to behold. Take a look at verse 9 one more time. Halfway through. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. This is a special star. Like, it just doesn't get you to a city, it takes you to a house. But it led them to Jerusalem first. Does that bug anyone? Bugs me. Bugged me all week. Here's why. Why didn't the star lead them to Bethlehem in the first place? Seems like a really special star. Why does the star lead them to Jerusalem and disappear, and this causing them to start asking questions in Jerusalem? Where's the King of the Jews born? Agitating the people, agitating Herod. Do you realize that if the star had led them to Bethlehem and not Jerusalem, there's a high probability that Herod would have never heard about Jesus being born at all? Because Jesus didn't do anything for 30 years in terms of outward ministry. A little kid born in Bethlehem, not even Jerusalem, like any other kid. And therefore, if the star didn't lead them to Jerusalem to begin with, it also means that all boys 2 years and under in Bethlehem wouldn't have been slaughtered. And yet the star led them to Jerusalem, where all of this was set in motion. Why? Well, part of the answer is that the massacre of the children was prophesied to take place. That's verses 17 and 18. What we have in verse 18 is a quote from Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. So it was prophesied to take place, but that's not very satisfying, is it? I mean, why did it have to take place? What's going on? Why did the star do this? And it's the star of Christ. Why? Well, there's an answer, but it's a sobering answer. And that is, the coming of Jesus brings light to the nations, but it also reveals the indifference and the darkness of our hearts too. That's what the coming of Jesus does. It brings division. It brings division that evidences itself in people willing to travel long distances so they can come and fall down before Jesus, and others wanting to kill him instead. It brings division. His coming reveals where our thrones are more important than his. His coming reveals where our titles are more than his. His coming reveals where our knowledge of the word is more important than the Messiah the word points to. And his coming reveals that those who we would think would be closest to him and most excited about his arrival may be farthest away. And those farthest away may be most ready to receive him. You see, what this is a living parable, albeit a horrific one in some places, but it's a necessary one. For sometimes it's the horrific that's necessary to draw us to Jesus and shake us out of our slumber and our indifference and our darkness. The indifference in this living parable is revealed in the chief priests, right? And the scribes who, think about this, Midtown, after telling Herod that the Christ was to be born in Bethlehem, and you've got these wise men, and you got this star that Herod knows about. After telling Herod, yeah, the Christ, he's going to be born in Bethlehem, they do nothing. They stay put. They don't go with the wise men. They know the word really well, but the word doesn't move them. And what good is the word if it doesn't move you to Jesus? It didn't move them to Jesus. And the darkness of Herod, I don't even know really how to quantify the darkness of his heart. He asks in verse 4 where the Christ was to be born, where the Christ was to be born. And when he gets the answer, he sends the wise men to Bethlehem with the ask in verse 8 that if they find him, let him know so he can worship him too. But in verse 13, we read there that Herod only wanted to know where the child was so he could destroy him. But who was the child? Well, we know the answer, the Christ. Herod said so himself. The Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the long-awaited one was the child. Herod said so. In verse 4, when asking again where the Christ would be born, he knew, but he still wanted to destroy him. Think about that. Herod sought to kill the Christ because he thought the child born was the Christ. And that not only agitated him, it threatened his power, which he loved most of all. And if that meant killing the Christ, and if that meant killing every 2-year-old boy and under in Bethlehem, then so be it. Think about how dark his heart was. And it's revealed in this living parable. The king of the Jews seeking to kill the long-awaited Messiah of the Jews. This is troubling if you're troubled by it. It should trouble us, but it's also part of the Christmas story that we have to behold. In Luke's account of the Christmas story, baby Jesus is brought to the temple, and there's a man there, a prophet named Simeon, who takes the little baby Jesus up into his arms. And when he did, he prophesied about Jesus in front of Mary and to Mary. This is what he says, and you can read it behind me. The child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed. That's what's going on in our text. Chief priests, scribes' hearts being revealed. Herod's heart being revealed here. The wise men's hearts being revealed too. The rising of the wise, the falling of the earthly king of the Jews. That's what the coming of Jesus does. See, the record in Matthew, this account here in Matthew 2 is dramatic, but we have to see its intent. We are to behold it because we too can be indifferent to the wonder of Jesus, can't we? We know the story, we know the text, but not moved by it. Isn't that possible? And we can be so in love with our power and position that we would much rather see Jesus dead than bow down to him. That's what this shows us. That's the purpose. Yes, it's dramatic. Yes, it's sobering, but it's so necessary. Because there's more in the individuals in this story that resemble us that we have to see. And we have to be woken up. And we have to be like the wise men. And that leads to a third reason why Jesus came. Why did Jesus come? Well, he came to be worshiped. And rightly so. I love that the wise men in verse 2 say that they have come to worship him, not just see him, not just take him in, but to worship him. And I love even more what we read in verses 10 and 11, that in contrast to Herod and the people of Jerusalem who respond to the news of the Christ's coming with agitation, what do the wise men do? What do we see in them? Take a look at verse 10. It's beautiful. I said I'd come back to this verse. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. That's quadruple joy. It's beautiful. It's joy on top of joy. But not only, when we get to verse 11, when they saw the child, they fell down and worshiped him. Picture the scene, if you can. I mean, we're doing a series on 1 Corinthians right now. This is a picture of what we've learned thus far in our study of 1 Corinthians. the wisdom of the world, the wise men, falling down and worshiping a 2-year-old, breastfeeding, diaper wearing, learning how to walk, learning how to talk Jesus. That's what's going on. And why is that? Well, we've learned from our study of 1 Corinthians in chapter 1, verse 25, for the foolishness of God is wiser than man, and the weakness of God is stronger than man. We have a picture of that right here. Can I ask you a question? Time is coming to an end here, but a couple more things before we close. What would you do if you saw your Messiah in bodily form, even if it was only a 2-year-old version of him? Would you fall down and worship him? Or would you stay standing? Maybe you'd stay in Jerusalem. They come with joy that exceeds joy, these wise men, and they fall down before 2-year-old baby Jesus. Do you know that Jesus is in bodily form now? Right now, as I speak. And he sees, and he's here. In fact, he's in you if you are in Christ. That we have opportunity to worship Jesus every moment of every day. And he sees our worship. I like some of you. That came out different. I like some of you. I do. I like some of you. Like some of you, have concerns over certain things regarding worship in our churches today. I think in some places there's more worship than Jesus himself. But that's not my biggest concern when it comes to worship in the church today. My biggest concern is that there are many who know the word really well, like they know Micah 5:2 and Jeremiah chapter 33, but they wouldn't be caught dead falling down and worshiping Jesus like this. And that concerns me more than anything else. There are 4 aspects of worship woven into this text that I want to just quickly highlight, and then we will point out one last thing about Jesus and then respond. First, the wise men proclaim the authority of Jesus by calling him the King of the Jews in verse 2. He's not only, but he's nothing less. He is the King of Kings, and he is the Lord of Lords, but he is also the King of the Jews, and they declare that authority. They proclaim it. Secondly, the wise men declare the dignity of Jesus by falling down before him in verse 11. Falling on our knees isn't dignified, but we need to be willing to lose our dignity in honor of his. Third, we see joy in their worship. I can't help but think that true worship is not just declaring the authority and the dignity of Jesus, but doing it joyfully. Do you have exceeding joy over Jesus? Like that rejoiced exceedingly with great joy? Do you have that kind of joy when you think about Jesus? When you worship Jesus, do I? And fourth, as they worship, they give him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And it's in their gifts where we see one last thing through their eyes for why Jesus came. What is that last thing? Jesus came to die. Now we know that because we have the rest of the New Testament story, but how do we know from this text, how do we know that Jesus came to die? What does this passage show us? Well, Isaiah chapter 60, verse 6 tells us that gold and incense, frank incense, are gifts fit for a king. But what is myrrh? Well, we read about myrrh later on in the life of Jesus. And we read about it when Jesus is on the cross and he is offered wine mixed with myrrh. What is myrrh? What does it do? Well, it dulls the pain. It's like a first century Advil. So Jesus was offered wine mixed with this pain reducer. I don't know how anything could remove or lessen the pain of being executed on a cross, but that's the point of myrrh. Here's the thing, when Jesus was on the cross, he rejected it. He turned it down. But here, he accepts it as a foreshadowing of that day to come. Myrrh is not a gift fit for a king, unless that king came to die, and Jesus did. Even at his birth, we are called to behold the cross. Midtown, Jesus came to die, and he came to die for people near and far. And that's why we do this series every year, because we need to remember that. And I pray that it would become fresher and fresher as we continue on in this series. Let me pray for us as we go into a time of response. And so, Jesus, we worship you. We worship you. We want to join the wise men from 2,000 years ago and worship you, fall down before you. The humble one who came, falling down before you. We do that now. We have an opportunity to do that now, to worship you, to remember you, the God who came for us and died in our place. We love you. I pray for our hearts that they would be soft to this message as we get closer and closer to the day on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, where we take time to remember the specific day to remember the birth of Jesus. Soften our hearts. And may this be a time in our city where we would see people come to know you, Jesus. We do pray for us as a ministry that as we do go out here in a couple of weeks, that you would providentially lead us to opportunities that would lead to people coming to you, Jesus. I pray for that in your beautiful name, Jesus. Amen.